Okay, so we're going to take your 4.5 notes right now, and they are about congruent triangles. So we know the word congruent, but when we're talking about congruent triangles, that means when all the parts of one triangle are congruent to all the corresponding parts of the other triangle. And when we say the word corresponding, kind of what we mean is the sides that match up with each other. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. You'll hear that word a lot in this unit. So if I look at my triangles over here, I have the side 3 and I have another 3. So those two sides are congruent and they are also corresponding. They match up with each other. And that's not just because they're both on the sides. We'll talk about that you can turn the triangles, but they match up because they're 3 and 3. Then this side here is 4 and 4. So those sides again match up. They are called corresponding. And then the last sides would be right here and right here. So that's the last pair of corresponding sides. There are also corresponding angles. So here 53 matches with 53. And then if you look at the colors, we're going to be looking at colors later too. They have yellow and pink, yellow and pink. Then we have a 90-degree angle and a 90-degree angle. And we have 37 degrees and 37 degrees. So we have sides that match up or are corresponding, and we also have angles that are corresponding. Now, technically the mathematical way to mark this is not with colors, but it would be with tick marks. So if I wanted to, I could put 1 tick mark on the 3s because they're congruent. I could put 2 tick marks on the 4s because they're congruent, but they're not congruent to the 3s. And then I could put 3 tick marks on both of the sides with 5. So you will see it marked with tick marks from the math book and in later examples, but if you want to use colors to help, then feel free to do that. So then we have corresponding parts. In congruent triangles, the corresponding parts are the corresponding sides, so those are the ones that we highlighted, and the corresponding angles, and we talked about which angles match up as well. So we're going to name which sides are corresponding and which angles are corresponding. If I look at this triangle, to name the yellow side, I would call it AB, and it's a line segment. And the side it's corresponding to is XY, and again it's a line segment. Then if I go to the orange side, or the 2 tick mark sides, I can say BC is corresponding to YZ, and there's not like a symbol for corresponding, so I'm just naming the sides that match up or are corresponding. And then I can say AC and XZ. Then if I wanted to name the corresponding angles, luckily in this picture I can name the angles with 1 letter, since you all know what I'm talking about if I say angle A. So I can say angle A corresponds with angle X. I know that because they're both 53 degrees. I also know if I'm looking at the color, I have yellow and pink on both. And the third way I know is if I look at my tick marks, I have 1 tick mark and 3 tick marks meeting in the corner. Then I can look at angle B, that has a 90-degree angle, so does angle Y. And finally angle C and angle Z. So those are my corresponding parts. Then if I write a triangle congruence statement, you're going to write a statement, so it's almost like a math sentence that matches up the corresponding parts. So when I'm looking at my picture, it's really important. The first triangle, you can name it pretty much any way you want. So I'm going to call it triangle, and I'm just going to call it A, B, C, because it's in alphabetical order. But then, once I name this triangle, the second triangle has to match the same order. So, since I said A corresponds with X, since A is first here, X has to be first here. Then, since B is second and Y corresponds with it, then I have to put Y second, and since C is last, remember that corresponds with Z, because of the 37 or because of the colors or the tick marks, any way you want to remember it. But C is the last letter, and it corresponds with Z, so that has to be the last letter. So the order of a congruent statement matters. Whatever one you put the first one, the second one has to match up in the same order of the corresponding parts. So we're going to practice that. So what you're going to do here, these triangles are congruent in number 1, and these triangles are congruent in number 2. You're going to write a triangle congruent statement for each pair. So your triangle congruent statement will look like this. You're just going to fill in the proper letters. So on this one, you can see we have all the tick marks. If it helps you, feel free to grab your highlighters or markers and highlight. So 2 tick marks and 2 tick marks are corresponding. So I made them the same color. 3 tick marks, 3 tick marks corresponding, same colors. And then 1 tick mark corresponds with 1 tick mark, so same colors. Then I can go through and do my congruent statement. So on number 1, I can say triangle, and again, I get to name this triangle any way I want. So I'm going to say E, I, G. Doesn't have to be that way, that's just the way I chose. Congruent to triangle. Now is when it matters. This one has to go in order. So since I put E first, I have to put Q first. Then I said I next. I has the same colors or is corresponding with O. And then G is last, so that means M has to be last. So this would be your triangle congruence statement. I'm going to match up the colors on this one, and then I'm going to have you try writing this statement on your own. So if you're using colors, you can match up 2 tick marks with 2 tick marks. See, this one's trickier. It's not lined up, right? So this pink is on this side, this pink is on the other side completely. So then I have 1 tick mark that corresponds with 1 tick mark. And then no tick marks, this side, is going to correspond with this no tick marks. And I know that because it says the triangles are congruent, so I know that the sides still match up even though they don't have tick marks. Alright, take a minute, see if you can write your congruent statement here. And what I'm going to say is yours might not match up with mine exactly. But as long as you put them in the correct order, like the second one, then you should be okay. So I'm going to go with triangle RTV. If you put yours in a different order, the first one, that's okay. But then I can say congruent to triangle. And if I started with R, that corresponds with X. So it has to go first. Then if I said T next, that corresponds with Y. And then V corresponds with Z. So if you wrote yours in a different way, for example, if you said TVR, then you should have said YZX. Or if you said VTR, you should have said ZYX. So this is not the only correct answer, but that's just the way, since I wrote this first, this has to be the second one. Alright, here's an example. So now we're going to try to fill in some information that we know from our congruent triangles. In this diagram, we know that triangle TJM is congruent to triangle PHS. So when we're marking it, I'm going to use my colors. Again, I'll show you with tick marks in a minute, so if you're not using colors, you can use tick marks. So T and J are the first 2 letters, so are P and H. That means those have to match up or correspond, so I'm going to use the same color. So TJ has to be the same color as PH. I knew that because the first 2 letters has to match with the first 2 letters. Then, grabbing my new color, I know that JM are the last 2 letters, so are H and S. So JM has to match with HS, so I can put my same color on those. And then finally, T is the first letter, M is the last, so TM. P is the first letter, S is the last letter, so P and S has to match up. If you're not using your markers and you're using tick marks instead, I could do the same thing. TJ and PH both have 1 tick mark. Then JM and HS both have 2 tick marks. And then TM and PS have 3 tick marks each. So whether you use colors or tick marks, it is important that the order of this statement tells you which sides correspond. Then what we're going to do is we're going to complete all these statements. So we say angle P is congruent to, and we're going to go look in the other triangle, so it must be congruent to angle T. They both have pink and yellow, or they both have 1 tick mark and 3 tick marks meeting at them. Measure of angle M. So this time it wants me to put a number because it says measure of, right? So angle M is right here. What I know from the colors is that it corresponds with angle S, which is 48. And if they're congruent, that means the same size. So angle M also has to be 48 degrees. MT, remember when it doesn't have a line above it, it wants the distance, so it wants to know that actual number. So MT has 3 tick marks and it's yellow. That matches up with this side, which is 5 centimeters. And then JM, this side is going to be congruent to which side. So it's not asking us for a number, it's just asking us which side it matches with. And JM matches with HS. Measure of angle P, that means it wants to know the number, right? Angle P is corresponding to angle T, so 73 degrees. And then triangle HPS. So now they're having us do a congruent statement like we did above. I'm going to have you fill that one in and then show it to your teacher. Alright, once you've filled that one in, I'm going to go a little bit faster on this one. So I'm going to use my colors to match up. AB matches with DE. BC, second and third letter, correspond with EF. And then AC, first letter, last letter, corresponds with DF. I am going to have you fill in AB. You should be able to do that one. I'm also going to have you fill in the measure of angle A. When we get to measure of angle B, it gets a little bit harder because you have to remember that triangles add up to 180 degrees. So you should be able to fill in that one as well. You're pretty much doing this problem on your own. The one I wanted to talk about was FD. Nope, you should be able to fill in FD as well. Alright, you should be able to fill in all of those on your own, and then you should be able to check with your teacher. Okay. Last thing we have to talk about today is if a triangle has an angle that measures 82 degrees, so I'm just going to pick an angle. This one looks good. And another angle that's 50 degrees, so that's this one. What does the third angle have to be? So if you couldn't figure out angle B and angle E in that previous problem, this is going to help you right now. Remember, triangles add to 180, so if I do 50 plus 82, that's 132, And if I do 180 minus 132, I get 48. So the last angle that we're missing would have to be 48 degrees. Then if we had a completely different triangle right here that has a 50-degree angle and also an 82-degree angle, what does the last angle have to be? So we don't have to go through all of this because it's the same angle measures. Right away we could know that this angle has to be 48 degrees. So there's a theorem for that, and that theorem is written here below. It says if two angles of one triangle are congruent, so if A is congruent to D and angle B is congruent to angle E, then the third angles are also congruent. So we don't know in this picture angle C and angle F are congruent. We only know that two pairs of angles are congruent. But because of the work we just showed above, we would know that angle C, so I'm putting 3 marks on angle C, is also congruent to angle F. 3 marks on there. And that will always be true, but it has to be 2 pairs congruent before you can make the third pair congruent. Okay. So we're going to do letter A together, and then you're going to do letter B on your own, and again show that to your teacher. So I'm going to match up the parts that go together. I know that WX is congruent to XY, and I also know that this middle side is congruent to itself, so that's the reflexive property. We haven't talked about that for a while, but if I separated these two triangles, these two would be the exact same length, and then that means this bottom part has to be congruent to this bottom part. So if I'm trying to figure out which angle X goes with, it would go with angle Y. So angle W and angle Y are the same size. But if I know that this top angle, angle YX, and then maybe if there was a Z down here, angle YXZ is 41, then I know WXZ also has to be 41 degrees. And I know that if this corner is 90, this corner also has to be 90. And I know that triangles have to add up to 180 degrees. Then I know that if I do 90 plus 41, I get 131. And if I do 180 degrees minus 131, I would get 49. So if this one's 49 degrees, this one automatically has to be 49 degrees as well. So X would equal 49. Okay, you're going to do this one, and your goal is to find the measure of angle D.